Welcome to Nightmare Network, where nightmares come to life. Get ready to dive into the darkest corners of the human psyche, where every shadow hides a secret and every whisper sends shivers down your spine. So grab a blanket, turn off the lights, and get ready for a journey into the unknown. I boarded the flight from Tokyo to Los Angeles, looking forward to some much-needed rest after a grueling business trip. Settling into my seat by the window, I took a moment to scan the cabin. Across the aisle, a little girl sat alone, her eyes wide with fear. She couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 years old, with dark hair pulled into 2 neat braids. I smiled at her, hoping to offer some reassurance, but she didn't respond. Instead, she kept her gaze fixed on the seat in front of her, clutching a small stuffed bear tightly to her chest. As the plane took off, I tried to focus on a book, but I found myself glancing at the girl frequently. She seemed so out of place, alone on such a long flight. I couldn't help but wonder why she was traveling by herself. Her wide eyes and tense posture tugged at my heartstrings. I considered asking her if she needed anything, but the presence of the flight attendants bustling up and down the aisle deterred me. About an hour into the flight, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. No one else seemed to notice the little girl. The flight attendants walked past her without a second glance, and the passengers around her were absorbed in their own worlds, reading, sleeping, or watching movies. It struck me as odd that a child sitting alone wouldn't attract any attention. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to ask one of the flight attendants about her. I pressed the call button, and a young woman with a pleasant smile approached. "Excuse me," I began, trying to keep my voice low. "There's a little girl sitting across the aisle from me. Is she traveling alone? Does she need any assistance?" The flight attendant's smile faltered slightly. She glanced at the empty seat I indicated, and then back at me. "I'm sorry, sir, but there isn't any child in that seat. Are you sure you saw someone?" I frowned, confused. "Yes, she's right there," I insisted, pointing again. But when I looked back, the seat was empty. The little girl was gone. A chill ran down my spine. I knew I had seen her. She had been as real as the book in my hands, the seat beneath me. But now there was no trace of her. The flight attendant gave me a concerned look. "If you need anything else, just let us know," she said before moving on. I sank back into my seat, my mind racing. Had I imagined her? It seemed impossible, but the empty seat across the aisle was undeniable. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the girl had moved to another seat, or perhaps she had gone to the restroom. I looked around, hoping to spot her, but there was no sign of her anywhere. The hours dragged on. The hum of the plane's engines and the soft murmurs of other passengers seemed distant, like I was submerged in a dream. I couldn't shake the image of the little girl, her frightened eyes and the way she clutched her bear. As the flight continued, I found myself increasingly anxious, unable to relax. Eventually, I decided to get up and stretch my legs. As I walked down the aisle, I glanced at every row, searching for the girl. She was nowhere to be found. I even checked the restrooms, but they were empty. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Returning to my seat, I felt a growing sense of unease. I tried to distract myself with movies and music, but nothing could erase the memory of her haunting gaze. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, pleading for help. As we began our descent into Los Angeles, I felt a mix of relief and dread. I was eager to get off the plane, to escape the inexplicable fear that had gripped me. Yet, I couldn't stop thinking about the little girl. What had happened to her? Had she been a figment of my imagination, a product of my exhaustion? When we finally landed, I gathered my belongings and prepared to disembark. The flight attendants were busy assisting other passengers, and I didn't feel like bringing up the girl again. It seemed pointless, and I didn't want to appear any crazier than I already felt. As I walked through the terminal, I tried to put the experience behind me. I told myself it had been a strange, vivid hallucination brought on by stress and fatigue. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that there had been something real about her, something tragic. I reached the baggage claim and waited for my suitcase. The airport was bustling with activity, but I felt oddly disconnected, like I was moving through a fog. I retrieved my luggage and headed for the exit, eager to get home and put the entire ordeal behind me. Yet as I stepped outside into the bright California sun, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I turned, scanning the crowd, but saw only the usual throng of travelers, none of whom paid me any mind. Still, the sensation persisted, an icy finger trailing down my spine. For days after, I couldn't escape the memory of the little girl. Her image haunted my dreams, and I found myself jumpy and paranoid, constantly looking over my shoulder. I even did some research, trying to find any information about a missing child or a plane with a troubled history, but I came up empty. Weeks passed, and the memory began to fade, though it never truly left me. Even now, as I sit here writing this, I can still see her face, those wide, pleading eyes. Was she a ghost, a figment of my imagination, or something else entirely? I'll never know for sure. But one thing is certain, I will never forget that flight from Tokyo to Los Angeles and the little girl who seemed to exist only in my mind, yet left a mark on my soul. On a flight from Sydney to San Francisco, I settled into my window seat, ready for the long journey ahead. As the plane began its ascent, I couldn't help but overhear a group of passengers behind me discussing the aircraft's dark history. Their hushed tones and nervous laughter drew my attention. "Did you know this plane has been in several accidents?" one of them said. "It's like it's cursed or something." Another passenger chimed in. "Yeah, but they just keep fixing it up and sending it back into service. I heard it was involved in a mid-air collision once, and another time it skidded off the runway." As their conversation continued, a chill ran down my spine. I tried to shake off the unease, attributing it to pre-flight jitters. But then, strange things started happening. The overhead lights began to flicker sporadically, casting eerie shadows on the walls of the cabin. I dismissed it as a minor electrical issue, but the sense of dread deepened. About an hour into the flight, the plane shuddered violently, jolting me in my seat. My heart raced as I gripped the armrests, looking around to see if anyone else had noticed. The other passengers seemed just as tense, their eyes darting around nervously. "Did you feel that?" whispered the woman sitting next to me. I nodded, swallowing hard. The air felt thick and oppressive, and I could hear strange noises emanating from the walls. Faint, almost imperceptible whispers and creaks that seemed to come from all directions. Trying to distract myself, I turned on the in-flight entertainment system, but it was no use. The screen flickered and then went black. I glanced around, noticing other passengers tapping their screens in frustration. The atmosphere grew increasingly tense, and I could feel a palpable sense of unease settling over the cabin. Then, without warning, the plane shuddered again, and the lights went out completely. A collective gasp filled the darkness, followed by panicked murmurs. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to see anything in the pitch black. In the silence, I heard faint whispers, like a distant conversation I couldn't quite make out. My breathing grew shallow as I tried to rationalize the situation. Suddenly, I felt a cold hand brush against my arm. I recoiled, my skin crawling with fear. The touch was icy, sending shivers down my spine. I wasn't alone in my fear. Passengers around me were murmuring, some calling out for flight attendants. "What the hell is going on?" someone shouted. Just as quickly as it had gone out, the lights flickered back on. I blinked against the sudden brightness, my heart still racing. The flight attendants were moving through the aisles, trying to calm everyone down. "Please remain seated," one of them said, her voice steady but strained. "We're experiencing some technical difficulties." I tried to convince myself that it was just a glitch, that there was a logical explanation for everything. But the whispers I had heard, and the touch I had felt, left me unnerved. I glanced at the passengers behind me who had been discussing the plane's history. They looked as pale and frightened as I felt. Hours passed, and the tension in the cabin remained high. Every flicker of the lights, every strange noise, sent a wave of panic through the passengers. I kept checking the time, willing the hours to pass more quickly, desperate to land safely in San Francisco. At one point, I decided to get up and stretch my legs. As I walked down the aisle, I noticed something odd, a section of the plane that seemed colder than the rest. The air was frigid, and my breath misted in front of me. I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter around me. "Is everything okay?" I asked a flight attendant standing nearby. She looked at me with wide eyes and nodded, but her face betrayed her fear. "Just some technical issues," she said, her voice unconvincing. I returned to my seat, my mind racing with thoughts of the plane's dark history. What if those accidents had left something behind, something that couldn't be repaired or exorcised? I shook my head, trying to dispel the irrational fears. As we approached San Francisco, the turbulence grew worse. The plane shook violently, and the lights flickered again. I gripped the armrests, my knuckles white. The whispers returned louder this time, and I could hear faint cries of distress mingling with them. Then, the cold touch returned, this time on my shoulder. I froze, too terrified to move. It felt like an icy hand pressing down, sending chills through my entire body. I wanted to scream, but my voice was locked in my throat. Finally, the plane began its descent. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, reassuring us that we would be landing shortly. The whispers faded, and the lights stabilized. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. When we touched down in San Francisco, a collective sigh of relief filled the cabin. As we taxied to the gate, I couldn't help but glance back at the passengers who had been talking about the plane's history. They looked shaken, their eyes reflecting the same fear I felt. As I disembarked, I overheard one of them say, "I told you this plane was cursed." I hurried through the terminal, eager to put as much distance between myself and that aircraft as possible. The experience had left me rattled, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been with us on that flight, something dark and malevolent. Even now, as I write this, I can still feel the cold touch on my arm and hear the faint whispers in my ears. I'll never forget that flight from Sydney to San Francisco and the sense of dread that seemed to linger in the air. Perhaps some planes are better left grounded, their dark histories buried with them. I boarded the overnight flight from New York to London, exhausted from a long day of meetings. The airport hustle, the security checks, and the final rush to the gate had drained me. All I wanted was to sink into my seat and sleep through the journey. As I settled into my window seat, I noticed the man sitting across the aisle from me. He seemed agitated, constantly fidgeting and glancing around nervously. I dismissed it as pre-flight jitters and closed my eyes, hoping to catch some sleep. About an hour into the flight, the gentle hum of the engines and the soft murmurs of passengers were suddenly shattered by a high-pitched, blood-curdling shriek. My eyes snapped open, and I turned towards the source of the sound. The man across the aisle was the one screaming, his face contorted in sheer terror. The entire cabin fell silent, and heads turned to see what was happening. Flight attendants rushed over, trying to calm him down. "Sir, please, you need to calm down," one of them said, her voice firm yet soothing. But he continued to thrash and howl as if possessed by some unseen force. His eyes were wide with fear, and he was gripping the armrests so tightly that I thought he might break them. The muscles in his arms stood out in stark relief, and veins bulged on his forehead. Passengers around us were whispering, some looking frightened, others annoyed. "Is he having a panic attack?" I heard someone ask. Another passenger chimed in, "Maybe he's just drunk." But it didn't seem like any ordinary panic attack or drunken episode. There was something profoundly unsettling about his behavior, something that felt wrong. I felt a chill run down my spine as I watched him. Then, with a suddenness that stole my breath away, he lunged at me. His eyes, wild with fear and desperation, locked onto mine. His hands reached out, and before I could react, he had grabbed my arm. "Help me," he gasped, his grip like iron. "They're coming for us." I tried to pull away, but his hold was too strong. "Let go," I yelled, panic rising in my chest. "Someone help me." A male flight attendant grabbed the man's shoulders, trying to pull him off me. "Sir, you need to let go of this passenger," he commanded. The man only tightened his grip, his nails digging into my skin. "They're coming for us," he repeated, his voice a terrified whisper. "Can't you see them?" I looked around frantically, seeing nothing but the concerned faces of other passengers and the bewildered flight attendants. "There's no one here," I said, trying to sound calm. "You're just imagining things." "No," he moaned, shaking his head violently. "They're real. They're here. They're everywhere." The flight attendant managed to pry his fingers off my arm, and with the help of another crew member, they restrained him, pinning his arms to his sides. "We need to get him to the back," the first attendant said. "Keep him calm until we can land." They began to drag him away, his screams echoing through the cabin. I sat back in my seat, my heart pounding, my skin crawling with the echo of his grip. I looked down at my arm and saw red marks where his fingers had dug into my flesh. The rest of the flight passed in a tense silence. The other passengers kept glancing back at the restrained man, who was now sitting in the back row, flanked by flight attendants. He had stopped screaming, but he was still muttering under his breath, his eyes darting around as if tracking invisible entities. I tried to close my eyes and rest, but every time I did, I saw his face, twisted with fear, and heard his chilling words. "They're coming for us." I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me like a dark cloud. When we finally landed in London, the man was taken off the plane first, escorted by airport security. As I gathered my belongings and prepared to disembark, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. But there was also a nagging curiosity. What had he seen? What had driven him to such madness? As I walked through the terminal, I overheard two flight attendants talking. "They say he had some kind of psychotic break," one of them said. "Must have been under a lot of stress." "Yeah, but did you hear what he was saying?" the other replied. "He kept talking about shadows and eyes watching him. Creepy stuff." I shivered, trying to push the memory of his terrified eyes out of my mind. I headed for the exit, eager to put as much distance between myself and that flight as possible. But that night, as I lay in my hotel room, the darkness seemed to press in on me. Every creak of the building, every shadow cast by the passing cars outside, made my heart race. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something out there, something unseen and malevolent. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that the man's terror had rubbed off on me. But deep down, I couldn't help but wonder, what if he had been right? What if there really was something coming for us?